In the early 1940s, during a period when the United States was still shaped by war tension and quiet rural isolation, a case emerged that would later be quietly archived under restricted religious records. It originated in a secluded Catholic convent located near the outskirts of rural Pennsylvania, not far from the small, fading industrial town of Ashburn, a place already known more for its silence than its history. The convent itself had existed for decades without incident. Built of old stone and weather-worn timber, it sat surrounded by dense forest that seemed to close in slightly each year, as if time itself was reclaiming the land around it. Life inside followed strict routine, unchanged for years, sometimes decades. Prayer, work, silence, repetition. Nothing unusual had ever been recorded in official visits, and nothing about the location suggested instability. That changed in the winter of 1943. It began with something so subtle it was almost dismissed entirely. One of the older sisters, assigned to record daily observations for internal archives, noted a minor inconsistency in behavior among several of the younger nuns. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than shared imagination or collective fatigue brought on by isolation. The convent had endured a harsh winter that year, with snow cutting off access roads leading into the surrounding Pennsylvania countryside for weeks at a time. During this isolation, something began to form within the daily rhythm of life. Multiple nuns began referencing a presence, not in alarm, not in fear, but in quiet acknowledgement, as though describing something as ordinary as weather or routine tasks. At first, these mentions were inconsistent and vague. A figure seen near the corridor near St. Agnes Hall. A presence felt near the kitchen garden. A man standing near the edge of the woods behind the convent, always observed briefly, and never approached. No physical evidence supported these claims. No footprints were found in the snow-covered grounds. No external breach of security was recorded. The convent gates remained locked, and only authorized clergy from the nearby diocese in Scranton were permitted access, and even then only rarely due to weather conditions. Still, the descriptions continued. What began to disturb the supervising Mother Superior was not the idea of a presence itself, but the consistency of detail emerging independently among the sisters. Without collaboration or shared discussion, multiple nuns began describing the same figure in increasingly specific terms. A man of average height, always dressed in dark clothing that did not belong to any known clergy uniform. A calm demeanor. A tendency to appear in peripheral vision rather than direct sight. More unsettling was the uniformity of emotional response. None of the sisters described fear. Instead, they described familiarity, a sense of recognition that they could not explain, as if the presence was not intruding upon their environment but returning to it. By the time the first formal internal report was drafted, the number of independent accounts had grown to 12. 12 separate individuals. 12 identical descriptions, 12 claims of interaction with the same man. What made the situation even more difficult to categorize was that none of the sisters had ever reported seeing the figure at the same time or in the same place. Each account was isolated, occurring during different hours of the day, in different parts of the convent grounds or interior halls. Yet the descriptions matched with a level of precision that could not reasonably be attributed to suggestion or shared influence. The convent's records from that period, later partially declassified for ecclesiastical review, show increasing concern not about hallucination, but about coherence. The problem was not that the figure was impossible, but that it was consistently impossible in the same way across all accounts. Investigators sent from the diocesan authority in Pennsylvania arrived in early February, traveling from Harrisburg through snowbound roads into the isolated region near Ashburn. By the time they reached the convent, the accounts had already stabilized into something more structured than rumor. The presence was no longer being described as occasional. It was being described as recurring, and always the same. A man who did not speak loudly, but whose presence seemed to alter attention itself. A man who appeared without entry and disappeared without departure. A man who did not belong to any recorded identity in parish or civic records. For those listening to the early reports that would later be archived under the title Liturgy of Dread, This is where the pattern begins to shift from anecdote into something far more difficult to dismiss. Because every system designed to verify reality within the convent confirmed the same contradiction. No one entered. No one left. And yet 12 separate minds described the same individual as though he had always been part of the place. By the end of the first week of observation, investigators began to note something else. The descriptions were not changing. They were refining, as if memory itself was settling into a shared version of something that could not be externally confirmed. And still, no one had yet explained the most important detail. Why 12 separate individuals, with no shared witness event, were describing not just a figure, but a presence that felt remembered rather than observed. And what remained unanswered was whether this was a case of shared imagination or something that had been present long before anyone thought to look for it. By the time formal investigation expanded beyond diocesan oversight, the convent outside Ashbourne, Pennsylvania had already become an administrative concern rather than a spiritual one. What began as internal observation had crossed into a category that required external documentation, and by early 1944, a small delegation with experience in psychological evaluation and ecclesiastical review was dispatched to the site. The journey itself reinforced the sense of isolation. Roads narrowed as they left the more populated stretches near Scranton and dissolved into wooded terrain where signage became rare and unreliable. The landscape around the convent was heavy with winter residue, trees standing too close together, branches bending under lingering snow that refused to fully release the ground. By the time the delegation arrived, the convent no longer felt like a place reacting to observation. It felt like a place maintaining itself under observation, unchanged by attention, as though scrutiny had no influence over its internal structure. The sisters were interviewed individually. Each account remained consistent. 12 nuns, 12 descriptions of the same man. No deviation in core identity, only slight variation in context of appearance. Some described him near the chapel corridors, others near the gardens. A few reported brief encounters near sleeping quarters during hours when the convent should have been at complete rest. Yet no one described a shared encounter. No two accounts overlapped in time or space in a way that would allow for verification through conventional means. This created the first major contradiction within the investigation. If the figure was physical, then his movement through the convent should have produced overlap in witness accounts or environmental trace. If he was psychological, then divergence in description would be expected. Instead, what emerged was something structurally consistent across isolated perception, uniformity, without shared observation. During environmental review, investigators found no evidence of intrusion. Doors remained secured, windows remained intact. Snow accumulation around entry points showed no consistent disturbance that could indicate repeated passage. Even internal corridors showed no irregular wear patterns that would suggest frequent physical interaction from an external source. Yet the accounts did not weaken under scrutiny. If anything, they became more stable. This was the point at which early psychological interpretation began to shift. Initial assumptions of shared delusion or suggestive influence were reconsidered due to lack of interaction between subjects during key reporting periods. The sisters lived under structured separation during much of the observation cycle, with limited communication outside of prayer and assigned duties. Cross-contamination of narrative could not fully account for the precision of consistency. By mid-February, investigators introduced controlled interviews, rotating questioning schedules, and independent writing tasks designed to isolate cognitive influence. Each nun was asked to describe the figure without reference to prior statements or shared discussion. The results were unchanged. Descriptions retained identical structural features, not just physical appearance but behavioral consistency. The man was always described as calm, observant, and aware of surroundings in a way that suggested familiarity rather than intrusion. There was no variation in emotional response, no escalation of fear, no contradiction in presence. But a new detail emerged during this phase. Each sister independently described a sensation of recognition that predated conscious memory of the figure, not as an event, but as familiarity that felt older than recollection itself. This is where the investigation began to lose its initial confidence in classification, because recognition without shared encounter introduces a category that sits outside standard psychological frameworks used at the time. It implies continuity of experience that cannot be traced to a single observable origin point. Meanwhile, within the convent, routine continued without visible disruption. Meals were prepared, prayers conducted, daily tasks completed in structured silence. Yet subtle behavioral changes began to appear in observational notes, slight pauses during routine activity, brief moments where attention shifted toward empty space without external trigger, instances where multiple sisters independently oriented toward the same corridor or doorway without verbal coordination. The phenomenon was no longer isolated to verbal description. It was beginning to manifest in behavior. At this stage, the delegation requested extended observation from outside oversight, and informal communication was sent to higher ecclesiastical authority. While not yet officially escalated to Vatican-level classification, the wording of early reports suggests hesitation in assigning conventional explanation. One report noted that the convent did not appear to be experiencing an event. It appeared to be maintaining one, as if the presence described by all 12 nuns was not arriving or spreading, but continuing under conditions that only now included external awareness. And still, no physical confirmation existed. No trace. No recorded entry. No identifiable anomaly beyond testimony. Only consistency. 12 independent minds describing the same man, with increasing certainty that he did not feel like something being seen for the first time, but something being remembered correctly after long absence. And that realization marked the point where the investigation stopped asking whether the figure existed and began asking whether existence required agreement at all. By the time the case reached higher ecclesiastical review, it was no longer treated as an isolated convent irregularity in rural Pennsylvania. The documentation had grown too consistent, too structured, and too resistant to conventional explanation to remain within local jurisdiction. What began in the winter isolation outside Ashburn had been forwarded through diocesan channels, eventually reaching advisory circles in Rome that handled reports considered unstable in classification but persistent in detail. At this stage, the language of the investigation shifted noticeably. Earlier references to reports and accounts were gradually replaced with patterns and recurrences. The emphasis moved away from whether the sisters were describing something real and toward how reality itself was being described in a way that remained unchanged across 12 independent perspectives. A preliminary Vatican review did not immediately confirm supernatural interpretation. Instead, it ordered an expanded verification process focused on environmental integrity, psychological isolation, and historical correlation. The expectation was still that the phenomenon could be reduced to either collective psychological reinforcement or external suggestion originating from an undetected source. What followed did not support either assumption. During the expanded observation phase, all external contact to the convent was minimized. Supplies were delivered without direct interaction. Personnel rotations were reduced. Internal movement within the convent was monitored under controlled schedules designed to eliminate overlap in witness exposure. Despite these restrictions, the accounts did not weaken. Instead, they became more anchored. 12 nuns continued to describe the same man with increasing specificity, not in contradiction, but in refinement. The figure was no longer described in vague terms of appearance alone. The descriptions now included patterns of movement, consistency of presence, and behavioral predictability that suggested long-term familiarity rather than brief encounter, and, still, no single verified moment of shared observation existed. What changed the direction of the investigation was not testimony alone, but the introduction of controlled environmental verification. During one phase of observation, sections of The convent were placed under continuous monitoring with no human presence allowed for extended intervals. Corridors near the west wing, previously identified in multiple accounts as a recurring point of appearance, were secured and recorded continuously for several nights. During this period, an anomaly was detected, not visual, not auditory in isolation, but environmental in nature. Multiple instruments registered a consistent shift in spatial conditions within a corridor that had been sealed and verified empty. Air pressure fluctuations occurred in patterns that suggested movement along a fixed path. Temperature differentials appeared in sequential alignment, as if something was traversing the corridor in a predictable manner. Yet no visual recording captured a corresponding figure. No shadows, no obstruction, no physical form. Only the consistent reaction of the environment to something that could not be seen. This was the first moment in the case where the investigation moved beyond testimony into interaction-based evidence that could not be easily attributed to psychological influence alone. The environment itself appeared to respond to structured presence without producing visual confirmation of origin. When this data was presented in review, the response was not immediate acceptance of anomaly, but increased scrutiny of instrumentation, reliability. However, repeated replication of the same pattern under controlled conditions reduced the plausibility of isolated malfunction. The pattern persisted. At the same time, internal behavioral logs from the convent began to reflect subtle synchronization across the 12 sisters, not coordinated communication, but aligned moments of attention. Independent reports noted instances where multiple individuals paused activity simultaneously in separate locations without audible cue or visible trigger. It was as if perception itself was aligning around a shared, unspoken reference point. The Vatican advisory response at this stage remained cautious. Historical precedent within ecclesiastical archives included accounts of collective perception phenomena, particularly in isolated monastic environments under extreme conditions. However, what distinguished this case was the absence of environmental contradiction. Nothing in the convent indicated fabrication, nothing indicated intrusion, and nothing indicated shared rehearsal of narrative. Instead, everything pointed toward consistency of experience that resisted reduction into any single category of explanation. By the final week of this phase, investigators began noting something that was not included in earlier reports due to its interpretive sensitivity. Across independent written accounts, the sisters did not merely describe the same man. They described him as if his presence predated observation, as if recognition was not being formed through encounter, but restored through awareness. This subtle shift altered the framing of the entire case, because if the figure was not being perceived for the first time but remembered consistently across independent minds, then the central question was no longer where he came from. It was why he was already known. And at that point, the investigation reached its most unstable threshold, because every system designed to confirm external reality continued to fail in one specific way. It could confirm environment, it could confirm behavior, it could confirm testimony, but it could not isolate origin. And without origin, the distinction between presence and interpretation began to collapse. What remained was a structure of agreement across 12 minds, and a growing uncertainty about whether agreement required something to exist, or whether existence had already been established through agreement itself. And somewhere within that unresolved space, the case stopped behaving like an investigation and started behaving like something that had already been ongoing long before it was ever recorded. By this stage in the investigation, the case had stopped behaving like a contained religious anomaly and started resembling something that affected the people studying it as much as the people inside it. What had once been treated as a structured report from a remote Pennsylvania convent near Ashbourne was now circulating through restricted Vatican advisory channels as a pattern that resisted stabilization under any single interpretive model. The most troubling shift did not come from the nuns, it came from the observers. Investigators assigned to extended review began reporting something that was not initially included in formal documentation. It began subtly, as most distortions of certainty do, a sense of familiarity when reviewing written testimony, a mild hesitation when comparing accounts that should have been separate, an increasing difficulty maintaining strict separation between recorded observation and internal interpretation. At first, this was attributed to fatigue, long hours, repetitive material, psychological suggestion from immersion in uniform testimony. But as review continued, the effect intensified rather than diminished. Those reviewing the case began independently noting the same sensation described in the convent itself. Recognition, not of a specific event or image, but of presence. A persistent impression that the figure described by all 12 nuns was not being learned for the first time, but recalled from somewhere just outside immediate memory. This reaction was particularly disturbing because it was not uniform across all staff, but it appeared in clusters among those exposed to the most consolidated versions of testimony. The Vatican response shifted quietly at this stage. Access to full documentation was restricted further. Secondary reviewers were assigned to cross-check interpretation integrity, and early psychological screening was introduced for personnel assigned to prolonged exposure. However, the effect could not be fully contained through procedural separation, because it was not tied to communication. It was tied to exposure. Meanwhile, within the convent, the phenomenon continued without escalation. There were no reports of increased aggression or instability. No deterioration in daily structure. Instead, the pattern remained consistent. 12 nuns continued to describe the same man, now with even greater certainty, as if repetition had refined rather than weakened the clarity of perception. What changed was not what they saw, but how certain they were that they had always seen. And one of the most detailed internal review notes from this period described a troubling shift in narrative stability. Earlier accounts had treated the figure as an anomaly within the convent environment. Later accounts treated him as an element of continuity, something that existed alongside the structure of daily life rather than disrupting it. He was no longer described as appearing. He was described as being there, always. The difference in language was subtle, but it altered the entire interpretive framework of the case. At the same time, environmental monitoring data from the convent began to show patterns that could not be easily categorized as either physical interaction or measurement error. Instrumentation placed in previously identified corridors registered repeated anomalies that followed consistent spatial sequences, as though movement was occurring along paths that were never visually confirmed. Yet every attempt to capture visual confirmation failed. No silhouette, no obstruction, no identifiable origin point. Only the reaction of the environment to something that could not be isolated within the constraints of observation. This was the stage at which internal Vatican discussion became fragmented. One group argued for continued classification as collective psychological reinforcement under extreme isolation conditions. Another group argued that the consistency of environmental response suggested interaction beyond perception-based phenomenon. A smaller, more cautious subset avoided definitive classification entirely, noting that both frameworks failed to account for the most persistent element of the case: consistency across independent minds without shared experience. And now, increasingly, consistency emerging in those who only studied the records. It was during this phase that a senior investigator assigned to longitudinal review submitted a private addendum that was never fully included in official circulation. The note described an experience that occurred during late-stage analysis of compiled testimony. While reviewing repeated descriptions of the man, the investigator reported a moment of cognitive disruption. Not hallucination, not emotional reaction, but a brief and disorienting sense that the figure being described was not being constructed from testimony, but re-encountered from memory. The sensation lasted only moments, but it was precise enough to be recorded as a deviation from expected analytical distance. The investigator withdrew from the case shortly afterward. No formal explanation was given in public records. At this point, the Vatican Advisory Committee initiated a full suspension, of open analysis and restricted all further interpretation to sealed review protocols. The case was no longer treated as an active investigation but as a containment archive, meaning that its primary concern was no longer explanation, but limitation of exposure, because something in the pattern suggested that prolonged engagement did not simply reveal information, it altered the observer. Back at the convent, however, nothing had changed in structure or behavior. The sisters continued their routines with the same measured discipline, yet the language in later compiled reports suggests a growing convergence in how they described their shared experience. Not agreement, convergence. As if multiple independent perceptions were gradually resolving toward a single stable interpretation that did not require external validation. The man, they described, was not becoming clearer because more details were emerging. He was becoming clearer because uncertainty was disappearing. And that realization led to the most difficult question the investigators had yet encountered. If 12 minds, isolated from one another, described the same presence with increasing certainty, and those who studied the accounts began to feel that same certainty forming internally, then where exactly was the origin of the phenomenon located? Inside the convent? Inside the observers? Or somewhere in the fragile space where observation and memory stopped? By the final phase of the investigation, the case had already been removed from normal classification systems within Vatican advisory records. What remained was not a live inquiry, but a sealed containment archive, one that continued to generate concern not because of new evidence, but because of what earlier evidence appeared to imply once viewed as a complete structure. The convent near Ashbourne, Pennsylvania was placed under reduced external contact. Officially, this was described as administrative stabilization following unresolved observational inconsistency. Unofficially, it marked the end of active interpretation. No further investigators were assigned. No additional field reviews were authorized, and yet within the sealed records, one pattern remained impossible to resolve. 12 independent accounts, 12 consistent descriptions, one man, never confirmed, never visually verified, but increasingly present in every layer of documentation that attempted to define his absence. The final compiled report noted something that had not been fully acknowledged in earlier phases. Across all 12 nuns, the description of the figure had ceased to evolve. Earlier stages showed refinement, minor adjustments in detail, shifts in perceived location or context. But in the final recorded cycle, something changed. The description stabilized completely, not because uncertainty remained, but because it no longer existed in their accounts. The man was no longer described as something encountered. He was described as something continuous, present in the same way memory is present, persistent, unquestioned, and no longer requiring validation through immediate observation. At the same time, internal reviewers who had been assigned to analyze compiled testimony began submitting unusual notes that were never intended for public circulation. These notes described a subtle but consistent effect experienced during extended exposure to the records, a growing inability to separate recollection from inference, a sensation that the figure being described was not being constructed from testimony, but retrieved from somewhere already familiar. Several reviewers independently withdrew from analysis at this stage. No formal explanations were recorded beyond standard language of professional fatigue and analytical discontinuation. However, internal correspondence suggests a more cautious concern. That continued exposure to the material was altering the stability of interpretive distance itself. The Vatican Advisory Board initiated full closure procedures shortly afterward. The convent file was sealed under restricted classification. No public statement was released. No doctrinal interpretation was provided. Only archival retention. But what makes the case persist within private discussion is not what was concluded. It is what was never resolved. Because every system of verification applied to the convent produced the same structural contradiction. No physical evidence of the man could be established. No external entry confirmed. No environmental trace supported independent identity. And yet, 12 isolated individuals maintained identical certainty regarding his presence, with increasing internal consistency over time rather than degradation. Even more troubling, those who only engaged with the documentation, not the convent itself, began reporting a secondary effect. Faint but persistent sense of recognition. Not belief, not interpretation. Recognition. As if the figure described in the records was not being learned for the first time, but remembered from a place that predated analysis. This is where the case enters its final unresolved state. Because if recognition can be shared across isolated minds without shared experience, and if that recognition strengthens rather than weakens with distance from the original environment, then the question of origin becomes irrelevant, not because it has been answered, but because it can no longer be clearly defined. The convent still stands in archival references as it did in the 1940s. A remote structure in rural Pennsylvania, near the quiet outskirts of Ashbourne, surrounded by land that has since changed ownership and function over time. No official religious community remains there. No active records are maintained on site. Yet in the final line of the archived case file, one investigator added a note that was never intended for public interpretation. It stated that the most disturbing element of the entire investigation was not the possibility that 12 nuns described the same man without ever meeting him. It was the realization that every system used to disprove his existence failed in the same way, not through contradiction, but through consistency. And that consistency raised a question that was never answered in any formal review. If something is remembered identically by those who have never shared experience, then what exactly is doing the remembering? The case was closed, but within restricted archives it is still referenced under a simple designation, not as confirmed phenomenon, not as confirmed hallucination, but as an unresolved convergence event. And anyone who reads it too long tends to notice something small, a quiet familiarity forming where there should be none, as if the story is not being read for the first time, but recalled. And in the words of the archive, the final line remains unchanged. Some presences do not appear, they are recognized.